this is where we held off. This is where we were last week. Ed's ugly particles. And if we looked at the code, let me just zoom in here. I'm not going to go through it all because I can tell you that it's really ugly. But I will give you the 30-second tour on what it does. What it does is in the enter frame listener for the player, we call particle draw. And here we pass in a display group where we want the particles to be drawn. We pass in the player object, and we pass in a parameter which is saying basically what is the radius about the center of the player where we want to draw our particles. Because the way this works, I'm going to switch over to my camera view for just a minute. I'm going to try to be tricky and use this drawing tool. Okay, so what we're trying to do, I'm going to draw, and this will show up on the screen in just a minute, is, okay, give it a minute. All right, so what we've got here is our player object, this circle. I'm a little messed up on the camera. So this circle represents our player, and this is the center, and what we do is we calculate an angle about the center in my code, and I'll show it to you again in a minute, and then we extend. I can't get my finger to work in the right direction. This is killing me. We extend along this vector that we've randomly chosen, and we place a dot there, or we place a particle, and then we do it again later, and there's a dot here, and a dot here, and a dot here, and we're basically randomly placing dots all over within the radius of our player object based on its current position, and then those particles, as the player moves, will trail behind, leaving the trail that we see in the example. So let me go back over to that. And if we bring the example up again, you'll see what I'm talking about here, which is drawn particles all about the center of the object at some distance from the center, randomly chosen, and then they just sit there in the world where they were at and trail behind. And then on top of that, what we did was I scaled down the size of the particle initially and changed the alpha a little bit, and then I used a transition to change the color, change the size, and change the alpha. So what that gives us is a particle that starts off big, gets smaller, and becomes a little bit more opaque. It starts off somewhat translucent and becomes more and more opaque, or what you would call less translucent. So it's suitable, it works, but it's really not that pretty. What we really want, let me make the code switch here. And hopefully we don't break anything. What we really wanted was this. So a much more attractive looking particle trail that, well, it's just closer to the original game. It's got nice blending effects, some coloration, a little bit of bloom, etc., etc.
Yeah, it looks like you're on fire.
Yeah, exactly. I'm on fire. So how do we achieve this? This is done literally with, let's go take a look. Top of the file, I include the CBE library. And if we look in my folder, basically I've copied the CBFX folder from the archive, the repository that I downloaded off the GitHub. Just copied it directly into my project. And then in my code, I say local CBE equals require, and I load the library Lua file from CBFX. And then when I create my player, it's really big, we do all the building of the player up here. We created a circle, we added a body, we set up the initial direction, I added a collision function, which we'll come back to in a minute, because I made some additional changes. We added the code that will handle listening for the event, so when we touch the screen, an event will be thrown. It's called on one touch. The player is listening for that, and it will change moving to the left, moving to the right based on its current direction. And then below this code, we have the enter frame where I used to, yes, okay, I'm sorry, had a brain fart there for a minute. Used to call the code that would draw the particles, but I've taken that out. And instead, right below here, I created an event using a preset, which I'll show you the code for in a minute, called burn2. And then I pass in a parameter called parent group, which basically says create event and place it in this group here, which is the same group that the player is placed in when we create it. So from then on, that vent, which is ejecting particles, will be in the same layer above the player object. And then I simply start the vent. So at this point, as soon as this piece of code executes, what we've got is this. Player hasn't started moving, but the vent has started to eject particles. So we get our little blob, and I've got the simulator paused. But as soon as I resume the simulator, the player starts to move, and the ejected particles then trail behind. So just to finish this off, the only other thing I needed to do, you'll notice that I stored the vent, which is returned by new vent, in a field called vent, oddly enough. I could have called it anything, on the player object. And then in the enter frame, all I do is update the X and Y position of the vent to be the same as the player. So every time the player moves, the vent moves. So a frame occurs, some physics work is done, the player moves a little bit, we enter the frame, we're getting ready to draw again, and I move the vent. So that way the vent is always either right at or just trailing behind the position of the player. So what about this business with the presets? Let's locate the presets file. The presets file is in CBFX. It's probably a little bit hard to read here. CBE core miscellaneous presets. A little bit hard to remember, but if you look in the CBFX folder, it's the only one called presets. So look for a file called presets.lua in CBFX, and if you open it, what you're going to see is a bunch of stuff. You really don't need to read all this. What you want to do is just do a search for the word burn. And as soon as you do that, you're going to see a table called burn colors, and you'll see one called burn2. And if you go further down, you're going to see this little bit of code here, which is the preset itself. This basically is the definition for the vent. Remember when I showed you CBFX, the sampler, and I showed you that one that looked like a candle or a torch? That was this one right here. And I said, this one looks pretty good. I kind of like that. So I took it and I copied it, and I got really creative, and I called it burn2. And then I just basically searched throughout the rest of the code. I didn't modify it yet, although this one is now modified. What I did was I simply renamed, I copied it, and I renamed everything that said burn to burn2. So this became burn2, this became burn2. Then I said, oh, this uses that color thing. Okay, well, I'll make burn2 colors. Let's just keep searching. And then I searched, wrapped around to the top of the file, and I said, oh, okay, I need to copy this. And I made burn2 colors. And then it looked exactly the same. So I ended up with a vent that produced a flame just like the other one, which is not what I wanted, because I don't have it working that way. But imagine, if you will, the player's moving along and it looks like a candle. Not what I wanted. So then I said, how do I modify this to, in effect, look like the game that we're trying to reproduce?